Hello everyone, I'm Marine Lefort, I'm a freelance publisher and you listen to Les Voix de la Photo. Les Voix de la Photo is the podcast that gives voice to professionals in the photo and image industry to reveal their journeys, their successes, sometimes their setbacks, and give us some advice along the way. Today, this episode is in English because I'm with Marta Weiss and we are at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. The V&A is my favorite museum in London, so I'm very happy to be with you today. Hello, Marta.
Hello. Welcome to the V&A.
You have been the curator of photography at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London since 2007, as the lead director of the Victoria and Albert Photography Centre, completed in 2023. So yes, last year. You oversaw the creation of the largest dedicated photography space in the United Kingdom. You are originally from New York. You study art history with a focus on photography at Harvard and Princeton and spent 2 years as a curator at the Department of Photography at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. During our conversation, I would love to delve into your journey and your contribution to the V&A. I'm particularly interested in gaining insight into the role of a photography curator within the museum. To start our interview, could you describe the environment you grew up in? Were you surrounded by family or friends who had a passion for the arts?
I grew up in New York City. My father was a professor of mathematics, and my mother, when I was growing up, was a potter. So I would say I was surrounded by a family interested in art, and my mother is certainly a very artistic person, and I grew up also enjoying always making art. We also went to museums very often. I always loved going to museums. I remember my sister kind of flopping a bit and complaining about being dragged to museums, but that was not the case for me. I have some very early memories in museums. I remember going to the Guggenheim Museum with my grandmother and being able to choose postcards after our visit of the paintings that were my favorites on that visit. I also remember going to see the Picasso retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art as a very young child and enjoying looking at the Cubist paintings and kind of searching them to find, where was the guitar and where was the glass and so on, and standing in front of the paintings and talking about them with my parents. As an older child, I went to the Metropolitan Museum often. It was near my school. It had a pay-what-you-wish policy at the time, and we had a teacher who encouraged us to pay a dignified quarter, and not to be afraid, basically, to just pay them, a tiny amount to be able to go in there. And when I graduated from high school, in our high school yearbook, which in America you often have your photograph at the back of the yearbook, and people usually put quotes from their favorite literature or their favorite music lyrics. My quote was from a book called From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler, which is about 2 children who run away from home to the Metropolitan Museum. So even age 17, that was kind of my fantasy.
So you wanted to work in a museum. So you went to Harvard. How was what did you study? It was history of art, but what was your years at Harvard?
Well, so the most undergraduate programs in the United States are liberal arts programs, which means that you do a very broad range of subjects and you only specialize for really about half the time. So you're not required to declare a major subject until the end of your second year. I actually ended up doing it slightly sooner. But when I arrived at Harvard, I didn't know what I was going to study. I thought history of art was one of several possibilities. I think I thought about anthropology at the time. I thought about English literature, history. There are also a number of programs at Harvard where you can combine different subjects like history and literature. And in my first semester, I took a course on surrealism, which covered art as well as literature, with a little bit of the kind of historical and sort of social context. And I absolutely adored it. And I think from there, I just kind of continued to pursue the visual arts, and eventually decided to what they call concentrate in, at the time it was called fine arts. They since changed the name of the department to history of art and architecture. I also studied alongside taking history of art courses, and my area of focus was modern art, which is to say 1789 to the present. Alongside my art history courses, I did a couple of courses in photography as well. So that helped introduce me to the work of many well-known photographers. In addition to the studio courses, we also had some lectures, and there were always a range of photo books on reserve for us in the library. And so I would go and look at those. And in my final year, we had a visiting professor, Joel Snyder, from the University of Chicago. At the time, Harvard didn't have a professor of history of photography. So that gave me the opportunity to do a course on the history of photography, and I found myself becoming increasingly interested in photography as a subject of art historical inquiry. I also, as an undergraduate, I think became increasingly interested in the idea of working in a museum. I was very inspired by some of the people who taught the courses I took, who were both curators in the museum, but also taught undergraduates. I also took courses in the materials of art with conservators from the Harvard University Art Museums. So I got a real understanding of how different types of art objects were made and how they needed to be cared for and how kind of physically they could be investigated. During my time as an undergraduate, that's also when Harvard hired their first curator of photography at the museum. And so I think that also helped kind of set that up in my mind as a possible career path.
And did you manage to do some internships at this time?
Yes, I did several internships, which again helped kind of cement my goals of eventually working as a curator. The summer after my first year, I had an internship at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. The summer after my second year, I had an internship at the Cooper Hewitt Museum, which is a museum of design, part of the Smithsonian Institution. After 2 years, I took a gap year. And during that year, I did an internship at the Peggy Guggenheim collection in Venice.
Wow.
And that was wonderful. It was dreamy and had actually been something that I had been aspiring to since I had been quite young. When I was about 9 or 10, I visited the Peggy Guggenheim collection with my family. I loved looking at the art there. And my parents got chatting with one of the people who were one of the gallery guards. And it turned out that she was an American undergraduate. And I remember saying at the time, when I'm in college, I want to do that too. And so about 10 years later, I did do that. So I wouldn't say I was working, continuously towards that goal, but it was something that I saw, I identified. It seemed really exciting and attractive to me. And then I did eventually do. And I spent the rest of that year mostly traveling around. I did do an internship for a short time in Prague at the National Gallery there. And I also taught English in Nepal and backpacked around India and Southeast Asia and visited Japan. And then finally went back to the United States and went back to Harvard for, what was that, my junior year.
Yeah, maybe sometimes it can help to do a long travel, like when you are back to, why you are working, and maybe Yeah.
Yes, I think I definitely returned to my studies with a kind of renewed energy and focus and maturity.
At the end of your study, do you know what you wanted to do?
When I finished my undergraduate studies, I had a pretty good idea that I wanted to go on to graduate school to do a PhD, with the ultimate goal of working in a museum. However, I didn't do that straight away. And I worked for 2 years for a graphic design company. I worked for a designer called Tibor Kalman, who was an American designer of a variety of different types of things. And at that job, I worked partly as a photo editor. So I was sourcing photographs and negotiating rights and so on, which gave me exposure to another aspect of photography. And I also gained more museum experience in that job because I helped prepare a retrospective exhibition about Tibor Kalman, which opened at SF MoMA, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, in the summer of 1999. And I finished that up, and then I started graduate school at Princeton.
Why Princeton?
I chose Princeton because I wanted to work with Peter Bunnell. Peter Bunnell was my doctoral advisor. He had started his own career as a curator at MoMA before being hired at Princeton in the mid-1970s. At Princeton, he was both the curator of photography at the Princeton Art Museum, but he was also a professor of the history of photography. And in fact, he was the first named he had the first named chair in history of photography in the United States. So he trained many people in the field, a lot of people who went on to become both academics and curators. And I think of these people as kind of my step siblings, my doctoral cousins or something like that, because we all trained under Peter Bunnell. So those people include people like Malcolm Daniel, who's the head of photography at Museum of Fine Arts Houston, Joel Smith at the Morgan Library, Peter Barberi at the Philadelphia Art Museum, and many others. And I was the last student that Peter took on. And I chose Princeton because I had the opportunity there to work with the collection at the Art Museum, and I did actually help put on a few small exhibitions as a graduate student, but also it's a great university where I had wonderful resources of the library and, of course, the rest of the faculty there.
And you didn't want to stay to work at Princeton at the end of your PhD? No?
Well, you mean in the art museum there?
Yeah.
Well, that job was already filled by the person who was my advisor. Other things brought me to the UK. So I had originally come to London to study when I was working on my PhD. So I was doing my archival research towards my dissertation, which was on 19th century British photography. I wrote about staged photography and photo albums in the 1850s to 1870s. And so I actually did a lot of my archival research right here at the V&A in our print room. And I ended up spending 2 years here doing my archival research and beginning to write. I then went back to New York because I had a fellowship at the Metropolitan Museum, where I split my time between writing up my PhD and doing curatorial work in that department. I did some research towards a catalog, and I had the opportunity to curate a small exhibition there, which was, of course, a great thrill for an early career aspiring curator. And at the end of that, by that point, the person who was to become my husband already had a permanent job here in the UK as an academic. And so we got married in New York, and then I joined him here back in the UK. So the first year or so, or first 9 months about, I was still writing up my PhD, and I began working part-time for a private collector, Michael Wilson, and then the job opening came up at the V&A. So I applied and began working here.
Could you walk us through the various projects you undertake as the curator at the V&A and in particular the Victoria and Albert Photography Centre?
So the Photography Centre was completed last year, May 2023. We opened the first phase of it in 2018. And in order to kind of fully understand it, I'll back up a little bit and explain that the V&A has been collecting photographs since it was founded in the 1850s as the South Kensington Museum. By 2017, we had over 500,000 photographs, a really significant collection of both historical material, but also coming right up to the present day. And in 2017, the collection of the Royal Photographic Society was transferred to the V&A from another national museum. It had been for about 15 years after having been purchased by the nation from the RPS. It had been in Bradford at the National Media Museum. That museum's part of the Science Museum group, and they felt they needed to reprioritize and decided that they could no longer look after that collection, and it was transferred here. So, as I said, we had about 500,000 photographs at that point, and with the RPS collection, we gained another 270,000 photographs, a library of 26,000 volumes approximately, and about 6,000 cameras and other pieces of photographic equipment, which previously had not been something we collected. So with our collection expanding so vastly and a bit of public pressure to show that we were going to look after this collection and make it accessible to the public, the museum committed to giving us a lot more space for photography. So in 2018, we doubled the amount of space we had. That was the first phase of the project. And then in 2019, I was appointed lead curator of the second phase, and that doubled the amount of space again. So we now have 7 rooms just for our permanent collection. It's over 1,000 square meters, and it's the largest space in the UK for a permanent photography collection. Within that, we have 4 gallery spaces, 2 that are for changing displays around the history of photography, 2 rooms that are for contemporary photography. We also have a room that's for digital work, and we have right in the center of the center a room dedicated to photography and the book.
Yeah, I really like this place.
It's a very beautiful room, the kind of place you want to stay in for a while, and you can, because we have some books that are just on open display, so visitors can just take them off the shelf and sit down and enjoy them right there. And then finally, we have a room with a walk-in camera obscura, which is a really fun, interactive way for visitors to learn how cameras work, accompanied by a timeline of other cameras.
How many people work in the photography department?
So we have 7 permanent positions within the team, and then we also have a few other team members who kind of come and go. We have a curatorial fellowship, for example, that lasts 2 years, and we have close relationships with certain universities where we have people who come on placements with us for 6 months or so at a time.
And because when you arrived,
when I first started here, there were only 3 of us in the photography team. So everything about photography has expanded greatly since I joined in 2007. I jokingly have said, actually, that, when I first started, our gallery was even smaller. So we roughly doubled our gallery space in 2010. And then, as I said, we doubled it again in 2018 and again in 2023. So at this rate, eventually we could maybe take over the whole museum. But I think we're not going to be greedy, and we'll just keep it to our 1,000 square meters that we have now.
I think what can be interesting also is to understand what you do. It's to maybe you can illustrate one project outlining the steps from inception to exhibition. For instance, you can speak about the exhibition Fragile Beauty, the collection of Elton John and his partner.
Well, Fragile Beauty is a tremendous show which has just opened to the public. It has over 300 photographs in it, and it was co-curated by two people at the V&A, Duncan Forbes and Lydia Caston, in collaboration with Elton John's own curator, Newell Harbin. But at the V&A, a tremendous number of people work on shows like that. And sometimes actually we collaborate with external people as well, so external designers. But we also have people we have the conservators who prepare works of art. We have registrars who deal with loans. We have the art handlers who hang the works. We also work very closely with our interpretation team. So they help us write the texts, or rather they edit the texts and help us make sure that we're conveying the stories, the narratives that we want to tell. We also work with our web team, for example, on what the content will be online, our learning team about programming around exhibitions, and other departments I'm probably not even thinking of right now.
Many people work in the V&A?
There are about 700 people who work here.
Yeah. A lot of different jobs.
There are a lot of different jobs. I remember the very first display that I mounted when I began working here back in 2007. Or maybe it was 2008 when I did the first display. But I was astonished at just to put on a display of, it was a small show about photographic books from the collection. And I think I counted that I had to work with 12 different departments in order to get it done. So we are a big place, yeah.
From your expert perspective, what significant development have you observed in the field of museum photography since you began your tenure as a curator?
Well, I think at the V&A, by having more and more space dedicated to just photography, we're actually going against a trend that I've noticed in other museums around the world, where photographs are now increasingly being integrated into collection galleries and are not given their own dedicated spaces. So one example of that is MoMA, where they no longer have a dedicated photography gallery, but you'll find photographs throughout the permanent collections. And I think there are pros and cons to that. I think it's great to see photography alongside other works of art. And that's one of the things that I love about the V&A, actually, is that within the wider museum, we're a museum of art, design, and performance. And so there's so many opportunities for bringing photography into dialogue with other art forms. However, I do think it's wonderful, and I feel really, really privileged that we have so much space dedicated to just exploring photography as a medium on its own. So aside from just having our team having grown, our collection having grown, the amount of public space for photography having grown. So the whole profile of photography at the V&A has grown since I've been here. Another really significant change is that we established what we call the Photographs Acquisition Group. And that's a group of collectors who donate a certain amount to the museum each year. And that everything that they donate goes directly towards acquisitions. And that has completely transformed our capacity for building up our collection. Before, we had a very small share of a budget, an annual budget for collecting, and now we have our own budget, and it's really enabled us to collect much more ambitiously than we could before. We work closely with our development team, and it does mean that some of my role has to do with working with patrons. We have events for our patrons. We travel with them sometimes. For example, we always meet up with them at Paris Photo, and sometimes we'll go around the fair with them. We do studio visits with them. And so there is that aspect of nourishing those and building those relationships. But I have to say, I quite enjoy that side of the job. I love photography so much, and I love sharing my passion for it with other people who are also interested. I think the model in the UK is somewhere in between the American one and the European one, where we do receive significant public funding. However, increasingly, we need to rely more and more on private funding. And so that's the model that we're working with. It's not nearly the same level of philanthropy that you find in the United States for various reasons, but it's an increasing aspect of how we work at the museum here.
Lastly, my last question is what advice, what guidance would you offer to individuals who aspiring to become curators in an institution like the V&A?
I think I would encourage anybody interested in becoming a photography curator to take any opportunity you can to look at photographs. Obviously, we encounter photographic images all the time, but to look at actual printed photographs, to look at photographs as objects, and to gain experience with that as much as possible. To look at photographic books too, because when you look at a photo book, you're seeing photographs, in a sequence, in a format that's, been very deliberately selected by the artist and their collaborators. So that's one thing. And then, of course, on the subject of books, obviously reading about photography and its histories and current thinking around it is also helpful. I think gaining hands-on experience wherever you can is really great. I think it's become, the landscape has changed, I think, a bit since I was doing internships and so on. And
in which way?
Well, okay, in the UK at least, we've become more conscious of what a kind of the lack of diversity in the field, and in order to remedy the lack of diversity in the workforce in the museum world, we have to be very considerate about who gets those kinds of early career experiences. Some of those internships are not paid, so it's in order to diversify things, we have to create opportunities where there are paid internships, where we can make it possible for people who don't have private sources of income to get that kind of exposure and experience that they need. So so that's one thing. I mean, so we, for example, we don't accept internships here that either are not paid or that aren't being done as sort of course credit as part of a program, an educational program. So that's just one example, but it's a broader topic that I think is a very important one. So yeah, I mean, I guess go to lots of exhibitions, look at photographs, read. Oh, I know. The other thought that I have, I mean, this is based on my own experience. For me personally, I feel glad that I focused on early photography at the beginning of my career, or rather in my studies, because I feel like it's easier to have a deep understanding of the history of photography and then build upon that to bring yourself up to the present, and to also be able to look at contemporary photography with the context of the sort of deeper history of photography. For me, as a curator, that's very important to how I think about things. Obviously, that's not the only way to go about things, but in terms of how I have developed into the curator I am, that's been very important for me. And then finally, I think it's a good thing to have some hands-on experience with photography. I think it does increase your understanding of how things are made. So to be able to have some experience with making photographs is a great thing. And increasingly, I would say, with understanding digital technology as well. That's not an area that is a strength for me, but I know that I would if I had some more experience with kind of, image making digitally, that would help me to understand digital work more.
Thank you. Thank you, Marta, for all your advice. You give us a lot of details about your project, and I think it's really inspiring for people who want to work in a museum. And the V&A is a really beautiful museum. So if people are living in London or like just visiting, I think it's a really beautiful space to go. And there are a lot of events. The programmation is really also really vivid. So really, if people are in London, have a look to the program.
Thank you. Yes, it's a very active time for photography at the V&A. The Photography Centre is completely free to visit, and I encourage anybody listening to this to come see us in person.
Thank you, Marta.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Les Voix de la Photo. In the notes of this episode, you will find a sign-up link to receive the Voix de la Photo newsletter. Sorry, it's in French, at least for now. Every 2 weeks, you will get a summary of the latest episode, exclusive content, my recommendation for reading, exhibitions or conferences, and sometimes even gifts. Also, to help spread the word about the podcast, I'll invite you to leave a comment and 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you want to share your thoughts, suggest people you would like to hear, or learn more, you can follow me on social media, on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. See you soon!